Jonathan threw his wife out, convinced she had cheated on him. But 10 years later, she came back with a truth that would shatter his world. What she reveals will shock even him. But let's start from the beginning. 10 years ago, Jonathan Weston, a successful millionaire and owner of one of the largest tech companies in the country, had his life turned upside down. He was known for his hard-nosed approach to business, but at home, Jonathan was a completely different person. His wife, Emily, was his rock, the one he shared his life with. But one day, something changed. He began noticing her frequent disappearances, phone calls she refused to discuss, and evening meetings she kept secret. One evening, after returning home from a long day of negotiations, Jonathan saw an unfamiliar phone on the kitchen table, and his suspicions piqued. He had enough money to hire the best private investigators, but he decided to figure things out himself. That night, his fears were confirmed. He saw Emily at a restaurant with another man. She laughed, leaning in closer to him than Jonathan could bear. It wasn't just a business meeting. In his eyes, it was an affair. A wave of jealousy and anger clouded his mind. He didn't wait for explanations. Returning home, Jonathan was boiling with rage. As soon as Emily stepped through the door, he was already standing there, his face flushed with fury. He saw the confusion in her eyes, but instead of asking questions, he went straight to accusations. "You don't know what you've done!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls of their massive house. "I saw you with him! It's over! Pack your things and leave!" Emily stood before him, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't cry. She was the kind of woman who remained calm even in the most difficult situations. She knew Jonathan wasn't just speaking out of emotion. He truly wanted her to go. He didn't give her a chance to explain, didn't ask what had really happened. She knew that if he had made up his mind, no words could change it. "Jonathan, please," she said quietly, her voice trembling but composed. "You don't know the whole truth." "I don't care to know," he yelled, cutting her off before she could continue. Emily nodded silently, realizing it was over. She went to pack her things. Her footsteps in the hallway were distant, like a whisper, quiet and inevitable. Half an hour later, she stood on the porch with her suitcase. Jonathan didn't look her in the eye. She left without saying a word goodbye. When the door slammed behind her, Jonathan was left in the silence of his enormous house. Now that his home was empty, he felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with a gnawing sense of loss that he hadn't fully processed. At that moment, he thought he'd done the right thing, that he'd rid himself of betrayal. But with each passing year, that conviction weakened. Jonathan's heart grew colder, and the house became increasingly empty, despite the luxury that surrounded him. Without Emily, his life turned into a cycle of business meetings, investments, and new projects. He immersed himself in work, but no achievement brought him the satisfaction that family once did. Although he never admitted it to anyone, each night as he lay in bed, he felt the ice of loneliness melting around his heart, leaving a painful emptiness behind. After Emily left, Jonathan's life became a relentless pursuit of success and recognition. Every morning began the same way: alarm, a brief breakfast in solitude, and a dive into the world of numbers, deals, and contracts. His schedule was packed with meetings, negotiations, and planning new projects. Jonathan had become the man he'd always dreamed of being, one of the most influential and successful businessmen. But the higher he rose, the deeper he sank into the abyss of loneliness. At first, he didn't realize how much he had changed. The first few months after the breakup were filled with anger and a determination to prove to himself that he had made the right decision. He threw himself into work, thinking that if he increased his fortune, he could forget the pain Emily had caused him. He bought properties in the most prestigious neighborhoods, collected rare cars, and even got a private jet, but none of these acquisitions brought him fulfillment. All his material achievements were empty without the happiness he once knew. Initially, work provided him with the illusion of solace. Every deal, every successful project brought momentary joy. But later, alone in his luxurious mansion, he felt hollow. He could sit in his massive office, surrounded by paintings from famous artists, with a glass of expensive whiskey in hand, staring into nothingness, feeling the void inside. Sometimes he fell asleep at his desk, buried under contracts and reports, trying to forget everything. Over time, Jonathan stopped socializing with friends. People who used to call him on every holiday slowly faded from his life. Maybe they got tired of his constant busyness and endless excuses, or maybe they just couldn't connect with him anymore. At yet another corporate party, he suddenly realized that he didn't know anyone in the room. Those who had once been close to him were gone, and all that remained were business partners, people who saw him only as a successful entrepreneur, not as a person. Meanwhile, Emily seemed to have vanished. None of their mutual acquaintances knew where she had gone. Jonathan heard from friends that after their breakup, she left town, but no one could say where. He didn't try to find out. The bitterness from their parting was too strong, and he believed it was best to leave everything in the past. She's no longer part of my life, and that's for the best, he told himself. But every time he passed her favorite cafe or heard her favorite song on the radio, something inside him broke. As time went on, the moments when thoughts of Emily resurfaced became unbearably painful. Jonathan could stand on the balcony of his huge penthouse, looking at the city lights, only to catch himself thinking about her. He remembered how she always smiled when they planned trips together, how just one word from her could lift his spirits, even on the hardest days. Now, his life was devoid of that lightness. Everything was too serious, too rational, and nothing could bring back the spark of joy he'd once felt with Emily. It seemed to him that over the years, he had built an impenetrable wall around himself, protecting him from emotions and memories. But no matter how hard he tried, some things couldn't be forgotten. From time to time, Emily's image would resurface in his mind. Her face, her voice. He tried not to think about her, suppressing those memories. But each time the night grew especially quiet. Each time his mansion stood empty, he would find himself thinking of his former wife again and again. He thought he had made peace with her disappearance, but deep down, he knew he hadn't found closure. He never tried to understand why she had been meeting with that mysterious man, never asked what had really happened. He just assumed the worst and closed the door on her and his heart. But this break had left a deep wound that grew more painful with each passing year. 10 long years had passed since Jonathan had driven Emily out of his home and life. All this time, he had lived trying not to think about the past, convincing himself that his decision was the right one. He believed that he had finally come to terms with what had happened. But one night, after an exhausting business trip, as Jonathan returned home late in the evening, his life changed once again. The mansion he had entered thousands of times over the years felt unusually dark and empty. He was used to the silence that greeted him each time he crossed the threshold. But this time, something was different. As he climbed the steps to the front door, he noticed a shadow. In the dim light of the street lamps, a woman stood in front of the door. Jonathan froze. His heart skipped a beat and then pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He stopped, trying to make out who the stranger was, and then he realized who it was. Emily. The woman he had once loved more than life itself. The woman he had accused of betrayal and thrown out without giving her a chance to explain. Memories flooded him like a wave. He stood in shock, unable to believe his eyes, as if his past had materialized right before him. Emily had changed. There was something different about her appearance. Something more mature, serene, and yet tinged with sadness. She was no longer the young, vibrant woman who used to meet his gaze with such confidence. Now her eyes held years of experiences, a depth that could only be acquired through time. She looked tired, but stronger, as if the past decade had only made her more resilient. Jonathan couldn't utter a word. His tongue felt glued to the roof of his mouth, and his thoughts were a jumbled mess. All the emotions he had suppressed for years came rushing back. His pride, his certainty that he had done the right thing, began to crumble. He saw her standing there, and he realized he was entirely unprepared for this encounter. "Emily," he finally whispered, barely believing he had spoken her name. She nodded softly, her gaze filled with pain and fear. She didn't smile like she used to, but there was a certain light in her eyes, as if she knew something important that he had yet to grasp. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice rough and tense. Every word seemed to come with difficulty, as though she was afraid she wouldn't have enough time, or that he wouldn't understand. Jonathan froze, He didn't know what to expect. Perhaps it was the very story she had wanted to tell him 10 years ago, when he had thrown her out without giving her a single minute to explain. His heart tightened with guilt. He suddenly realized that all these years, he had lived with an open wound that never fully healed. "Come in," he said quietly, opening the door. Her footsteps were barely audible, but each second of waiting stretched into eternity for Jonathan. Inside, he was torn between contradictions. On one hand, he feared what she was about to tell him, and on the other, he desperately wanted to know the truth. As they entered the house, Jonathan noticed how tense and cautious Emily moved through the familiar corridors. Her presence felt strange, as if time had turned back. But Emily was no longer the same woman who had once shared this home with him. He could see it in her eyes, her posture, in every movement she made. "You need to sit down," Emily whispered as she sat on the couch. Her voice trembled, and Jonathan sensed that something very important was about to change his life. He sat across from her, still not fully understanding what was happening. All he knew was that the woman he had driven out of his life years ago was now sitting in front of him, about to reveal a truth that, he felt, would turn his world upside down. "You don't know so much, Jonathan," Emily said, lowering her gaze, as if it was too hard to look at him. "Everything that happened back then, it was a misunderstanding. You didn't give me a chance to explain. I left because I thought it would be better for both of us, but I had to come back to tell you the whole truth." Jonathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Everything he thought he knew about that fateful day now seemed fragile. His certainty was crumbling like a house of cards, and he didn't know what to say. All these years, he had convinced himself that he had been right, but now he was faced with the possibility that he had made a mistake, an irreversible one. Emily raised her eyes and looked at him with a sad smile, as if she were about to share a secret she had carried for all those long years. When Jonathan and Emily sat down at the table, the room filled with a heavy silence, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready to hear the truth he had avoided for so long. Emily sat across from him, nervously fiddling with the edge of her bag. It seemed like she was gathering her strength to say the words she had wanted to say for years. Finally, she took a deep breath and began her story. 10 years ago, Jonathan, I wasn't just meeting with some man like you thought. That man was a private detective. I hired him to find out the truth about your business. I felt that one of your partners was trying to sabotage you. I saw how tense and anxious you had become, and I wanted to help you without tarnishing your reputation. Emily looked at Jonathan, her eyes filled with sorrow. She saw the shock on his face. He was stunned. He couldn't believe that all these years he had been wrong. His suspicions had been entirely misplaced. I knew that if I told you about my suspicions, you might not believe me or simply brush them off. You were so absorbed in your work, and I didn't want you to worry about a threat that I thought was real at the time. That's why I acted in secret," Emily continued, her voice trembling from the memories. "You were so busy, and I didn't want to distract you from your work, but I had to act quickly. I thought I could figure everything out and protect you without disrupting your world." Jonathan, overwhelmed by her words, remained silent. He felt torn apart by guilt. He had been so sure of her infidelity, never asking questions, never giving her a chance to explain. He had cast her out of his life without ever hearing the truth. "But you threw me out," Emily said quietly, her eyes welling with tears. "You didn't want to listen. I was trying to help you, but you decided that I had betrayed you, even though I loved you more than anything in the world. I left because I thought it would be better for you if I were gone." With every word she spoke, Jonathan felt his world collapsing. He realized that all these years, he had lived in error, accusing her of betrayal when, in fact, she had been trying to protect him. He had driven away the one person who had truly been on his side. "After you threw me out," Emily continued, her voice barely audible, "I didn't want to come back because I thought it would be easier for you. I left. I found my place in the world. I gave up all the wealth you offered because I no longer needed it. I started helping other people. It brought me peace. I found purpose in supporting those who needed it. Jonathan listened to her with a profound sense of shame. She had given up everything they had and found herself in serving others, while he had buried himself in work, trying to forget her. He didn't know what to say. All these years, he had believed he was right, and now he realized how cruelly he had been mistaken. Emily raised her eyes and spoke with a soft but firm tone. I didn't come back for money or to be a part of your life again. I came back to tell you the truth you needed to know, and I want to forgive you because I know that back then you were hurt and couldn't see the situation clearly. I don't hold any resentment against you, Jonathan. Forgiveness is not just for you, it's for me too. Jonathan was stunned by her words. He didn't know how to respond. All these years, he had lived in a world of his own making, where he believed he had done the right thing. But now, he realized how gravely he had erred. His eyes filled with tears, and he felt a tightness in his chest, a painful mix of regret and guilt. Emily, he said, his voice trembling. I don't know what to say. I can't undo what I've done. But if you can forgive me, I'll do whatever it takes to make amends. I lost you once because of my foolishness. I don't want to lose you again. Emily nodded quietly, her face calm. There was no longer pain in her eyes, only wisdom and understanding. This conversation marked the beginning of their reconciliation. Jonathan realized the full weight of his mistake and was ready to do whatever it took to earn her forgiveness. He was no longer the man who refused to listen. Now he understood that the most valuable thing in his life wasn't wealth or success. It was the people he loved and those he had lost because of his own actions.